Jericho, the ancient city located 10 miles north of the Dead Sea. It was prosperous due to being in a strategic location in terms of trade routes. It had its own spring and an ideal climate for agriculture. So outwardly, it was successful and thriving. But internally, it was morally corrupt. It boasted 2 layers of powerful walls, and the sinful people thought that these man-made walls would keep them safe. But there was someone in Jericho who knew better. Rahab. She recognized that God's judgment was about to fall on Canaan. Rahab knew that they were doomed. But God knew of Rahab's faith, and he orchestrated a fateful meeting with 2 spies and a symbolic scarlet cord of hope, so that, in God's mercy, she and her household would be saved. To learn more, join me for today's episode of All Things Apostolic. Joshua and the Israelites were preparing to cross over the Jordan River and begin conquering the land of Canaan. Joshua sent 2 spies ahead to Jericho, and they lodged at the house of Rahab. Now, there's a lot of speculation about how they ended up at the house of Rahab, because the Bible clearly calls her a harlot. Even in the New Testament, in Hebrews 11:31 and James 2:25, she is called a prostitute, and the Greek word definitely means prostitute. Interestingly, the Hebrew word translated as harlot can also be translated as innkeeper. In the West Semitic world in the 2nd century BC, innkeepers were associated with prostitutes. Immorality was so prevalent in Canaan that lifestyle was accepted by society. So Rahab was probably both an innkeeper and a harlot. Being an innkeeper would explain how the 2 Hebrew spies ended up at her house. That would have been a good place for the spies to stay and mingle and be less noticeable. But someone did notice them. Their presence was told to the king of Jericho, and he commanded Rahab to bring forth the men. Instead, she hid them and told the king that they had left at dusk around the time of the shutting of the gate, and she didn't know where they had gone. She urged the king's men to pursue after them. As soon as the pursuers had gone out of the city, the gate was shut. It was not unusual for a walled town to close its gates at night, especially when there was an enemy nearby. But this detail becomes important in the escape of the spies. Once the king's men left, Rahab went to the roof where she had hidden the 2 Hebrew spies. And she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you, when ye came out of Egypt, and what ye did unto the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And as soon as we had heard these things, our hearts did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. This is an amazing statement. Rahab mentioned 2 things that she had heard about the Hebrew people: that God had parted the Red Sea so they could cross on dry ground, and how Israel had recently defeated 2 Amorite kings. Now, different people may have had a different perspective of these events, but Rahab saw them as proof that the God of the Jews was indeed the God in heaven above and the earth below. Rahab probably also knew that there would be no survivors once Israel captured Jericho. Israel would do to Jericho what had been done to the Amorite cities, because God had commanded it. Rahab pleaded with the spies to swear that they would save her father's household, since she had shown them kindness. When Rahab referred to her father's household, that meant her extended family as well. During this time period in Semitic society, the father's household was the basic family unit led by the oldest male. So here Rahab was basically negotiating on her family's behalf. The spies promised that when the Lord gave them the land, they would deal kindly with her. The spies didn't say if the Lord gave them the land, but when the Lord gave them the land. The spies had no doubt that it was going to happen. Then Rahab let them down by a cord through the window, since her house was upon the town wall. She asked the two spies for a token, and they pointed to the scarlet cord that she had used to let them out of the window. The spies told her that when they returned, that she had to bring all of her father's household into her house, and they would protect whoever was in the house marked by the scarlet cord. As soon as the spies departed, Rahab bound the scarlet cord in the window. She was not wasting any time. And then she told her family. We don't know any details, but they believed and found safety in her home, and they were eventually saved. It's interesting that Rahab told the spies to hide in the mountain for 3 days until the pursuers returned. In the late Bronze Age, Hittite instructions to the commander of the border fortress specified that enemies would be pursued for 3 days. So this was probably standard practice for this era, and Rahab knew it. But also, if an officer did not find and kill his enemy in that time frame, he was to be turned over to the king for punishment. So you can imagine the risk that Rahab was taking. If the officers who failed to find the spies would be punished for not completing their task, what could happen to Rahab for treason against the king? Joshua chapter 6 details how God enabled Joshua and the Israelites to conquer Jericho. They utterly destroyed all that was in the city, but saved the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron to put in the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua saved Rahab as the spies had promised. Actually, God saved Rahab. When the priests blew their trumpets and the people shouted, the walls collapsed, except for the part of the wall that held Rahab's house, the house with the red cord hanging out the window. Archaeology supports this. German excavations in the early 1900s on the northern section of the city showed that there was a portion of the lower city wall that did not fall as it did everywhere else. That area was still intact. Then Joshua's men rescued Rahab and her family. And it's appropriate that Joshua was the leader who fulfilled the promise and saved Rahab and her family. Remember that the name Joshua means Jehovah or Yahweh is salvation. And Joshua 6:25 said that she dwelled in Israel even unto this day. It's interesting that Rahab had gotten to a place in which she knew that judgment was coming and she needed help. She admitted that all of the inhabitants were afraid because they had heard about what the Lord had done for the Israelites. Rahab and all of the inhabitants of Jericho were going to have to face the judgment of the living God. And that fear motivated her to be prepared. As an aside, that's still a powerful motivator today. When people can recognize that they're lost and sinful and they want to avoid God's righteous judgment, then sometimes they're willing to get their heart right with God and to get their life right. So the fear of the Lord is an important factor in saving souls. Also, Rahab recognized that the God of the Israelites, whom she named by name, is God in heaven and in the earth. She had heard all that he had done, and she believed. And she knew that her only hope of being saved was through God's people. Do you think it was a coincidence that the 2 spies came to her place? God needed them to be successful in their mission, so he needed to protect them. At the same time, God knew about a sinful pagan woman whose heart had already been softened, and she desired to have a way of escape. In the whole city, God ensured that the 2 spies who needed protection met with Rahab, who desperately desired salvation from the impending judgment. God put the right people together at the right time. Now, Rahab could have believed in the power of the king or his army, and she could have believed in the power of the walls. Her house was in a great location. Jericho was surrounded by 2 walls that were 30 feet high. The outer wall was 6 feet thick, and the inner wall was 12 feet thick. Between these 2 walls was a space of 12 to 15 feet. Houses were built between these walls. Can you imagine the sense of security that these massively tall and thick walls would have provided? For everyone else, they gave a false sense of security. But for Rahab, she knew that these walls were nothing compared to the power of the mighty God. And when God's judgment fell, those walls were the first thing that fell. It's interesting to compare this story with the failure at Kadesh Barnea in Numbers 13 and 14. 40 years before the episode at Jericho, Moses had sent 12 men to spy on the land of Canaan. These men were named in Numbers 13, but Joshua only sent 2 men, and they were unnamed. The 12 spies looked over Canaan for 40 days and then decided that they couldn't conquer it. The 2 spies made a quick trip to Jericho and found out that the people feared them. The 12 spies brought back grapes, figs, and pomegranates, but Joshua's 2 spies announced they'd found a harlot who trusted the living God. The 10 spies who said that they couldn't conquer the land had caused discouragement, and then a whole generation lost out on the promise. But the 2 spies provided Joshua with the confirmation he needed for attacking Jericho. It makes you wonder if there's any relevance to sending 2 spies. Perhaps a smaller operation was more than appropriate for the situation. But perhaps, based on not wanting history to repeat itself, Joshua knew that it only takes 2 to correctly assess the situation. Now let's talk about the scarlet cord. This is one of the most important parts of the story. It is referred to 3 times in verses 15, 18, and 21. Joshua 2:15 says that Rahab let the spies down by a cord through the window. The Hebrew word is chavel. The word can also be translated as a rope or band. The narrator used just one word. In verse 18, the spies told Rahab to bind in the window the line of scarlet thread by which she had let them down. So they were clearly referring to the same thing they had used to climb out the window and down the wall. But the spies described it a little differently. This description had 3 words: line, scarlet, and thread. The Hebrew word translated as thread is hut, and it means a cord, line, or thread. The word for the color scarlet is shani. So these 2 words have a pretty straightforward meaning. But the word translated as line in the King James Version is the Hebrew word tikva. It is only translated as line or cord in Joshua chapter 2, verses 18 and 21. But this Hebrew word occurs more than 30 other times in the Old Testament, and it's never translated as line or cord in those other verses. The word is translated predominantly as hope, and sometimes expectation. It is something hoped for and longed for. So knowing this, let's re-examine these 3 verses. Verse 15 is very matter-of-fact. Rahab let them down by a cord or rope. In verse 18, the spies instructed her to bind this hope of scarlet thread. In verse 21, After the spies left, Rahab obeyed and immediately, without hesitation, bound the scarlet hope. See how carefully the writer gives us such important insight. The Bible is beautiful and amazing. The spies let her know that the scarlet cord or thread was her lifeline. It was her hope of deliverance, and she obeyed by binding the scarlet hope to her window. Now, I do like the wording of thread in this story because there is a thread of scarlet throughout the Bible. There is a theme throughout the Bible of the importance of blood. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. It began back in the Garden of Eden when God clothed Adam and Eve with the skins of animals. For Rahab and her family, the scarlet cord was like the blood on the doorposts of the Hebrew households in Egypt. When the avenging angel saw the scarlet blood on the doorposts and passed over each house that had it, now there were avenging Israelites, and the scarlet cord would protect everyone inside of Rahab's house. This was her Passover experience. By faith, Rahab hung that scarlet cord in her window to gain salvation. And, of course, the scarlet theme of blood throughout the Bible culminated in Jesus' sacrifice at Calvary because we are redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ. Besides this Old Testament story, Rahab is mentioned 2 times in the New Testament. Hebrews 11:31 says that by faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not when she had received the spies in peace. Now, the Bible gives the impression that others in Jericho could have been saved if they'd only believed. All of the inhabitants of Jericho had heard the same news about Israel and Israel's God, and all of them were afraid. But only Rahab put her faith in Israel's God. So she's listed in the famous chapter in Hebrews, along with others who had strong faith. In James 2:25, Rahab is mentioned again as an example of faith paired with works. Because of her faith, she did a good work by sparing the spies. The story of Rahab is truly remarkable. She started out as a pagan harlot in the morally corrupt city of Jericho. But because of her faith, God blotted out her past, and she became part of the messianic lineage. She married the Israelite Salmon. Who was her son? Boaz. Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. Rahab the harlot was saved and redeemed, and she became the ancestor of King David and of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. She was a sinner who became part of the family of Christ. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of All Things Apostolic, and until next time, take care and God bless.